Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This is Sabrina from DFC. I'm joined here today by Deb, who will be our presenter for the next hour or so. I do have everyone muted, so if you have questions as we go throughout, you can feel free to leave those in the chat window. There's a little icon in the top center of your screen. And I'll be reading those questions, and I can pass them along to Deb as we go. If not, we'll wait until the end, and I will open up the phone lines, and we will take questions then as well. So with that, I will pass it along to Deb.
I have one quick question for you.
Sure.
Somebody popped up a Skype meeting for this. Do you want me to join that also?
Nope, I think it just says Skype meeting.
Okay.
But it's really, just join me.
Okay.
You're good.
I'll just leave it then. All right. So hi, everybody. We are going to go through inventory today. And like Sabrina said, if you have any questions as I'm going along, type those into the message box, and Sabrina can just interrupt me as we're going, or you can hold your questions to the end, and I'll answer there as well. If we don't go in depth enough, or after the webinar and you're thinking about it and you have more questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we will get those questions answered for you. So we're going to start today in inventory in setup with inventory control. So as you all know, you're using GP. All of the modules have the separate boxes, and setup is one of those. You have transactions, your reports, utilities, cards, inquiry, and routines. So we'll be in most of those today, and if you have, again, any questions on those, we'd be happy to help you with that. So under setup and inventory control is where you need to start when you're setting up your inventory. Within this window, the things that we have are the user categories. What these allow you to do is to track additional information on your inventory items. There's 6 user categories. They are user defined. You can define them however you want. So in this case, I have manufacturer, style, and feature. For this inventory that I have in here for the most part is like phone systems and wire cables and extension cords and those types of things. So for manufacturers, you could have the different brands of those extension cords. For a style, you could do something along the lines of, even color breakdowns. So are they a white extension cord? Is it a black extension cord? And then the features that are included with that, you could track, say, if it is a 3-prong plug-in or just a 2-prong plug-in. Those would be the different things that you could track on that user category. And so when we get into item maintenance, then we'll take a look at those on the items. The center section here is the next document numbers. So these document numbers you can adjust. Generally, they start out with 10 or so zeros and a 1. You do want to make sure that when you adjust these, you leave enough zeros that you're not going to run over or end up starting over on your transaction counts. So as an example, if in the first adjustment item that I set up here, if I blank these out and just left myself 4 characters, I would only be able to do 9,999 inventory adjustments, and then it would want to roll over. So you do want to make sure that you leave enough leading zeros in these document numbers so that you don't have to worry about that really for as long as you're going to be using the system. So you want to just prepare to make that a bigger number. You can adjust the leading part of that document number. So I've included INV-ADJ for my adjustments, a TRF for my transfers, and I did include the INV as well. And then you have your variance transactions, your production transactions. If you're using bins, you would have the bins transfer. I also have in-transit transfers. The next segment or section is to define the segment ID for the site. So in this case, I've said that my site segment is going to be division. So when I look at my chart of accounts and I have my different divisions in my segments, then based on what's selected on the transaction, so as an example, your sales transaction, based on the site that you select, that the system will automatically put in the appropriate segment number from your general ledger onto that transaction for the distribution, and we'll go through that as well. Then, on the far right, we have our default decimal places. So what this is saying is, for your quantities, what are the default decimal places you typically will sell your products by or purchase your products by? What that means is, and it is just a default, you can change on individual items how many decimal places you need. You have choices from 0 to 5, but the default is what's just going to do just that, default N. So you can leave this at 0 if you want, which means you're not going to sell a partial of something. You're not going to sell a half a can of paint or half of an extension cord. You wouldn't have a 0.5 or a 0.25 or a 0.75. You would only have whole numbers on that. The lower section of the inventory control setup window is where you're choosing what adjustments, variance, or transfer overrides you're going to allow. So what that means is, if you choose to allow an adjustment override, will you be able to make an adjustment to send that balance to a negative number? So can you override it so that you would show a negative adjustment and make the total of the quantity for that item negative? You have the same thing with variance overrides and transfer overrides. It's just going to allow you to make these transactions that would send those balances into a negative. The next area is enabling multiple bins. So this is where if you need to have multiple bins for items, you can define those here that you allow to do that, and then in the setups you would choose to use multiple bins. The enable picking shortage tasks, that's for when you're picking tickets off for an order. And do you want to allow then being able to create a task, assign that it would be a shortage for the quantities available. The auto post stock count variances, when we look at stock counts, you'll be able to see where that is and where the allowance is. But what happens there is when you're doing your stock count, and once you have that finished and your counts all completed and you have variances on those counts, the system would automatically post those through the GL so that you don't have to go in and make those additional transactions. And on the stock counts, you'll be able to see where those transactions are. The last one here, for using existing serial or lot numbers only on decrease or transfer transactions, what that means is that you can't create a new serial or lot number if you're doing a decrease or a transfer transaction. So if you're doing, say, a decrease transaction on a lot numbered item and you actually wanted to create a new lot for that particular quantity, you would not be able to do that if you had this checkbox marked. This checkbox will allow you only to use that existing serial or lot number for those types of transactions. And then the auto-assign lot numbers based on, you can choose to do either receipt date or expiration date. That'd be really your company policy on how you want to assign lot numbers. Then the display, you have a checkbox for the cost of decrease adjustments. So do you want to be able to see the cost for any decrease adjustment transactions that you're making? And then the last section here is the use expired lots. And do you want to be able to use expired lots in your inventory adjustments and transfers and any other transactions? And if you do, you have the ability to create and set up a password on those transactions so that if users are creating that transaction, they would have to enter in the password. If you leave it blank, a password is not required. So from this window, then you can also get into inventory item classes. And this is where you can define the classes that you're going to group your inventory by. In this case, the message that I have here, a default class has not been selected. All that's saying is that when I look at my inventory classes that I have set up, I haven't selected one of these to be a default class. So you have a number of different classes. You can create as many different classes as you need to. I'm just going to bring up one of them here so that we can take a look at it. So in this case, I've chosen the cordless phone as a class. I can define the description for that. We have the ability to choose the generic description here, and then you're going to have your item type, valuation method, and anything you're going to track, whether it's serial or lot numbers. So our item types, first of all, we have our sales inventory, discontinued, kits, miscellaneous charges, services, and flat fees. Sales inventory and discontinued, once you have generally selected sales inventory for your items, this is where you're going to be tracking quantities, costs, sales. You're tracking all that information on those particular items. You can make an item discontinued and then still be able to track costs and quantities on that until the total quantity of the item you have is consumed. Then we have kits, and we'll get into kits as well when we're looking at the inventory items themselves. Miscellaneous charges, services, and flat fees. So a lot of times we'll have customers that will set up service type items where you're not tracking quantities for items, but you do want to have a consistent way to enter in information about those inventory items. So we'll have labor set up as a service type item so that you can consistently track labor on, say, sales orders, but you're not necessarily tracking any costs or quantities on those within the inventory module. Then we have our valuation methods, FIFO and LIFO perpetual, average perpetual, and then both FIFO and LIFO periodic. Those are going to be based on your company's setups. There are legalities as far as changing to different valuation methods, and those you'd want to have your accountants in as part of the discussion on what you need to do to make changes to your existing valuation methods. And then tracking, our choices here are none, serial, or lot numbers. You can assign these at the class and roll the information down, or you can make changes on the individual items themselves. Then we have our sales tax options here where we can choose to have non-taxable, taxable, or based on the customers. So taxable is going to be based on the items. Based on customers means the system's going to look at the tax schedules that are set up on the customers and pull that information in on transactions. Whether or not you want to allow back orders, and then choosing to revalue inventory for cost variances and defining a tolerance percentage for that. So what's the tolerance allowed for that cost variance? If it exceeds that, the system won't allow you to do that. You also have the quantity tolerance percentages for shortage and overages, and we'll get into those. But again, you're defining a percentage here on what's an allowable percentage for either an overage or a shortage. The maintaining history, calendar, fiscal, transaction, distribution, those were put in originally when GP was written. It was DOS-based, and back in the day, server space was an issue. That's no longer a problem. You'll see these questions for maintaining history throughout GP, and you can just leave those all marked. There isn't a reason now why you would need to uncheck to not maintain history for each of the modules. Then we have our quantity decimals. Again, you can choose by class what are the decimals you want to track this item with. And in this case, the class. By setting up your classes, you have that ability then to roll down the information to the inventory items that you've created, and this saves you time then in setup. One thing to note with that is if you come in and you've set up your items and you've assigned a class to them and then you come back into the class and make a change, the system will ask you to roll that down to the existing items that have that class. So it would make changes then based on what's set up on your class if you choose to roll that down. If you don't roll that down, it will only affect, the changes that you made will only affect new items that you assign to that class. Then we have our unit of measure schedule, and we'll get into that next. Then our price groups and default price levels. Again, these can be assigned at the class and then rolled down to the individual items. Our purchase tax option, very similar to our sales tax option, except now it would be based on the vendor versus the inventory items that you have set up. We can see our user categories here. In this case, manufacturer, style, and feature, and then the items that we've assigned to those user categories. And then if we want to include the items in a catalog, we can define that catalog here. If you're using multi-currency, you would go in and define a currency, and then we can go into the accounts and look at the default accounts here. So in looking at the accounts, we've got these all set up where our division is 000, and then our individual account numbers. By doing that and then defining the division on the inventory control setup that's going to be used to define our segment based on the site, then when I enter a transaction that has a class ID of AT&T Cord, it'll define that first segment for me based on the site that I use on the transaction. The expansion arrow from each one of the lines for the accounts will allow you to just go in and see the account entry information for that account. So that's our inventory item classes. And I'm going to close out of inventory control setup. And the next thing that we're going to go in and look at is the unit of measure schedules. The unit of measure schedules allow you to track the different ways that you sell particular items. The biggest thing to keep in mind in the unit of measure schedule setup and unit of measures is your base unit of measure is always the smallest way that you work with that product. So I've got a unit of measure schedule ID set up for cans, so like soda cans, soda pop. My lowest base unit of measure is an individual can, and because I don't sell parcels of that can, my quantity decimal places is 0. So as you can see down below, the first line that is always going to be on your unit of measure schedule setup is going to be that lowest base measure. So it's 1 can. The equivalent is how many cans make up that unit of measure. So we have a can is equal to a can. If I look at a 6-pack, that 6-pack is made up of 6 cans. And so what that means is when I do a purchase order or sales order and I choose to use 6-pack on my unit of measure, then when that transaction is received in, then the system will automatically update the inventory quantities for that item based on the equivalent back to cans. So if my purchase order says 1 6-pack, when that gets received in, the system knows that it needs to update my quantity and add 6 to the quantity of my can item. We can do the same thing with cases and 12-packs. So in a case in this particular instance, I've defined that a case is equal to 24 cans, but I've also said that a case is equal to 4 6-packs. We can do a 12-pack. That's going to be 12 cans. It could also be 2 6-packs, or it could be 2 12-packs. So the key here, again, is to make sure that your base unit of measure is the smallest unit of measure that you work with, and then to define the different ways that you're going to work with, whether you buy or sell that product based on those unit of measures. So another example in here is measuring for hours. So we can look at hours. In this case, our base unit of measure is hour, but we do have a quantity of 2 here because we could work in a half an hour or a quarter or 3/4 of an hour. So we'd want to have 2 decimal places available for a 0.25, 0.5, 0.75 of an hour. Again, our first line is always going to be that base unit of measure. So an hour is 1. A half day we've defined as 4 hours and a full day at 8 hours. So if I do a transaction and I choose a unit of measure of full day, the system is going to know that it should be 8 hours. Okay, the next area that we're going to take a quick look at is the stock calendar. And within that stock calendar, this is where you're defining how you want the system to count the number of days between your stock counts. So if you're doing stock counts, say on a monthly basis, maybe you're taking a section of your warehouse and doing 1 section per month, you want to be able to count that month or X number of days. Do you want it to include Saturdays, Sundays, or both, or none? So if you say you want the stock count to recur every 35 days, where should that count be? Should it be including Saturdays and Sundays or not including those? That's what your stock calendar is tracking here. Then our reason codes. Reason codes are what are used on inventory transactions, adjustments, and variances, as well as transfer transactions. So your reason codes are what are you using, and I don't have one set up in here, so I will set one up right now. I'll just call it damaged. And then you're going to define where this reason code should be used. Do you want it to be able to be used on adjustments or variances or both? Until you check one of these boxes, you can't enter an account number in here. And what this is going to do is it's going to give you the offset account number that should be used for whichever transaction you select here. So if you choose adjustment, you have the option then of both increase and decrease adjustments, and what is the offset account that you want to use for that. Maybe you have a specific account set up for damaged inventory that you're going to move from your inventory, your main inventory account to your damaged goods inventory, just so you're tracking that and going to write that off, or however you're going to track that information. So I'm going to put in 14. My inventory account. And we'll just choose one of these for now. We'll put it on as 1312. So that's the account that'll be used if I do an inventory transaction with a reason code of damaged goods. Okay. The next area that we're going to go into is into cards. So cards is always your main maintenance area. Within this window, we're looking at setting up items, kits, bill of materials, and sites. The first area that I'm going to go into is sites. And site maintenance is where you're going to define the different, not only sites that you have within your inventory, maybe you have multiple warehouses, but you can also define further in that within a particular warehouse if you wanted to, and do something similar as far as the different regional areas. You could do a site as far as different users or technicians. if they have specific inventory information. You may have your truck set up as sites, and you're tracking the inventory that's on those trucks. It could be moved then from the warehouse onto the trucks and then can be dispersed from the trucks based on the transactions that you enter into the system. So I'm going to actually choose my North Regional. And within this, then you can define the account segment. So this is where in your item control or inventory control setup window, we defined which division, or rather which account segment is going to be our determiner for the different divisions on the account for the transaction. And then we're going to choose which segment we want to use for this. So in this case, if our 01 North Regional is going to be for service and installation, then we're going to select that. Then when transactions are entered, the division segment will automatically be replaced with this division based on the transaction being assigned to this site. And we'll walk through a transaction for that also. From this window, you can also go in and assign bins for that. And these are the default bins then that would be used. And I'm going to save this. And then you can also assign then particular items to these sites. So whether it's by item number, generic description, class ID, or by vendor ID. And that's just saying then that item is linked to that site, and you can do multiple at a time based on these restrictions. So where if you were setting up a new item and had not done the item site assignment, from this window, you can do multiple at a time rather than doing them individually by transaction. And then from the site window, you can also get into planning. And this is doing the order up to fixed order point quantities, replenishment, lead time, and these are being done then by site. So that's something to keep in mind, is that this particular window is doing this by site. So you can assign a buyer ID, a planner ID, then your order policy, whether it's not planned or use PO generator. Your fixed order quantity, again, for this site, your order point quantity, the number of days, your replenishment method, whether it's make or buy, or make or buy, in this case, only make or buy, and then the lead time. So how much lead time do you need to get those items in for this particular site? And I'm just going to discard that for now and save this. Okay, the next area that I'm going to go into is items. So within the item maintenance window, I'm going to bring up an extension cord. So this is giving me my item number, how I want to track that item in the system, my full description of that item, that's roughly about 100 characters, then our generic description and our short description. So one thing to note when you're doing a lookup on an item number, one thing that you want to use for ease of use for your end users is you can run by generic description here. The short description is not an out-of-the-box choice because it's in your second column. You can use the generic description within this window. We typically will use the short description or the generic description if you're doing barcoding to put in a barcode ID for that particular item. It'll depend on how many characters that barcode is. The one thing you want to make sure, though, is that you're consistent using that, whether you're using short description or generic description. Then again, we have our item type and valuation method, the sales tax options, and depending on what you're using for your taxable or non-taxable, then you can assign that tax schedule ID. Your unit of measure schedule ID is going to get assigned. If you want to put in shipping weight information, you can do that. The class ID, this again is going to be based on how you set up those item classes. And if you choose, you can just, as you're setting this up, once you've entered in your description, you can go right to that class ID and just choose the class ID and roll down all the information that's on the class. So you don't have to go in and rekey all of this in for each of the items. You can just choose to do that from the class ID. Then we've got our purchase tax option, our standard cost, and our current cost. You're also going to have the quantity on hand and the total quantity available. So within this window, again, if you roll down from the class, you want to make sure that if you go in and you make any changes to that class, you will be asked if you want to roll that down. So let's say you had this set as taxable, and you went in on the class and you changed the class to non-taxable and rolled that down, it would change that. So you do want to make sure that you're consistent in how you want to roll those down, and just be aware that if you make that change, it will change the items on that. If you choose not to roll it down, it'll only affect items going forward that are assigned to that class. From this window, we can get into the options window. This is where you can define substitute items. So do you want to track substitute items for a particular inventory item? If you're out of that, you can make recommendations. The tracking, whether it's none, serial, or locked, allowing back orders for that particular item. What are the warranty days? Do you want to track the warranty days on a particular item? Your ABC code, and that can be used for prioritizing these. So how do you want to define that? The type of item that it is, whether it's a finished good component, a finished good, a kit component, or a kit, if that applies. Which catalog is it going to appear in? Again, we have our categories. So different ways that you can report on these particular inventory items. So if I want to choose the manufacturer here, the style, the features, again, we have our maintain history. When you're done there, you can click on OK. We're going to have our accounts. Again, our accounts will default in this case. Then when we enter transactions, because we have defined the sites to define the account number by segment, then any transactions based on that site will change this first segment for me. The suggest items window, this is where we can go in and enter in suggested sales items for individual items and what you have out there as far as different quotes, orders, invoices, or fulfillment orders. And then from this window, you can get into the all-in-one view. And that all-in-one view is going to show you all of the information related to this particular item number. So we can see quantities coming in, quantities moved, and quantities coming out. You have that all-in-one view also on customers and vendors. You can also go into, purchasing, so purchase orders, purchasing transactions, as well as sales transactions. You can see the all-in-one views and see all of the transactions related to a particular customer, vendor, transaction, anything related to that, and it puts it all very conveniently right in this view. Then from within this view, you can click and go into an individual transaction. You have your additional button, which will take you just into service extensions in this case, and then your go-to button, which is the most used. You can go in from here and get right into, say, price lists if you're going to assign those. I'm going to say yes to save my changes. And so we'll clear and bring this up. So we'll bring up another one here. And go into price list. So price list maintenance is where you're allowed where you can go in and assign the different price lists for a particular inventory item. In this case, I've selected another cord, and my price method is a % markup based on the current cost. So it'll be defining then what my percentage markup is based on the cost that I have set on the item. So I'm assigning not only my unit of measure for selling, as well as my default price level. Within those price levels then, you set that up by assigning the price level and the different unit of measures. But you do want to make sure that you have all of the unit of measures that you're using to sell your items included in that price level. So as you can see for this item, I have unit of measures of each and case, and I have a price level for each one of those, and then what my price is going to be for each of these. Then from this window, you can get into quantities and sites, and this is going to show you all the quantities related to an individual site, or rather to an item, and then you can break it down by site as well. So if you choose the site radio button, you can choose a different site and see quantities based on those different sites that are set up. Within this window, you can also choose your item print option, whether it's individual, bulk, or both. Your order vendor ID, so where do you typically order that from? Your primary vendor ID, so who's the primary vendor that you get that product from? And then you can also get into bins, planning, and your stock count. So within planning, this is where you're defining on the item itself the planning for the ordering of that item. We have our order policy, our fixed order quantity, and that is what is the fixed order amount that you always want to order. If you put in here 40 and the system is telling you that your quantity is, say, 25, if you have a fixed order of 40 here, when you go and do a purchase order for that, then the system will automatically default in the 40 that you have set up as the fixed order quantity. Your order point quantity is looking at what quantity on hand do you have that you want to or need to order additional product. So if your order point quantity is set at 10 and a recent sales transaction dropped your quantity down to 5, then the system will automatically recommend ordering enough to get you back to whatever either your fixed order quantity is or your order point quantity, being in this case 10. Now you're below that, the system knows that you need to order that. The order up to level, that's saying what do you want to order to keep, what's the minimum quantity on hand you want to keep track of. So if you've got that set at 15, then the system will go in and do an order to bring up to that 15. So in that prior example where we went down to 5 based on a sales transaction, then the system's going to do a transaction for a quantity of 10 to bring you back up to 15, your order up to level. Then you have your replenishment method for this particular item, a shrinkage factor, and then purchasing lead time. So if it takes 10 days, then you want to look at, the system will look at generating orders based on your quantity, fixed order quantity, order point quantity, and order up to levels. The for reference only section down below is just that. It is for reference only, so it's not going to get included in any of the fixed order quantity, order point quantity, or order up to levels. You can track your reorder variance and your safety stock. The key note there is that your safety stock quantity should be included in your order point quantity. So if your safety stock is having 10 on hand, then that should be included in your total order point quantity amount. And if you have any questions on that, feel free to let us know. Then we have our stock count, and this is where we're just seeing the information related to an item, when the last stock count was done, the interval days that you've defined, and based on that, when is the next stock count date that that item is scheduled for. Okay, the next window then is the purchasing window, and this is where you're defining the purchasing options. So again, we have our base unit of measure, but you can define your default purchasing unit of measure. So what that means is that, say for this phone cord, maybe my default unit of measure is cases, because regardless of the fact that I sell them at one, and that's my base unit of measure, I may always purchase those in a case. So if I define my default purchasing unit of measure of case, when I go to do a purchase order for this item, it'll automatically default in case for me and order it by the case. Then we have our revalue inventory cost tolerance percentage for variance, for a cost variance. And again, this would be just a percentage you're going to enter in as far as what that cost variance tolerance is. So if you go and you get a quote from your vendor for what the cost is going to be, and then when you get the invoice, that cost has changed, what's the tolerance percentage amount that the system will allow to go through? So if it's $1 a cord, but you get the bill then, and the bill is $12.50 for your case of 25-foot foam cords, that tolerance would exceed the 10% tolerance, and therefore the system would stop on that. It wouldn't accept that. You can do the same thing with a quantity tolerance percentage. So if it's over, so you order one case and they send you two, is that going to be able to be received in or not based on those tolerances, whether it's a shortage or overage? So if they short you and they send you 5 instead of 10, can you receive that in, or do you have to send it back and then wait for them to send the rest in? Also within this window, the gear off the item number gives you your manufacturer's item numbers. So this is an additional place that you can track information, potentially barcode information as well for individual items. You would define then whether it's manufacturer information, and you can store additional barcodes here for the items as well. And I'm going to save that. And the next section that we're going to take a quick look at is vendors. So the item vendor maintenance. What GP allows you to do here is your item list may be different than what your vendor's catalog or item list is. So you can assign the corresponding vendor item number to your item number, so that when you're doing things like purchase orders, you can use then that vendor item number and you don't have to do any kind of cross-reference. The system allows you to set that up within those individual items. So I can see that my item number in this case is an ACS-CRD-25BK, but my vendor that I purchased this from just calls it a 25 cord. So the system then allows you to track what the vendor's item number is, and you can link it back to your item number and vice versa. You also can choose what the default purchasing unit of measure is for a particular vendor. So where on the purchasing window that we just looked at, we said that that was the case, or rather a case. We can do the same thing and define it further, saying that if I order from Convex, then I want to order a case. Or maybe I don't. Maybe in this case I want to just order an each. So if the PO is for this vendor, then even though my purchasing unit of measure is case, because I've defined it on the vendor as each, then the PO will be each. The other thing within this window is looking at what minimum, maximum, and economic orders are, as well as order multiples. So you can look and say, what's your minimum order? Maybe the minimum order in this case for this vendor is 10. So even though you need, based on, say, your order point quantities, you need 5, because you've defined your minimum order as 10, that's what the PO will generate with. If you set a maximum order, it works that way as well. So if you say your maximum order is 50 and you try to order 100 of them, the system's going to stop you for that one. And then there's economic orders as well. What makes most sense, dollars and cents wise, for those particular orders. And order multiples. So do you have an order multiple that you need to track with that order? Kits. So to talk about kits, first of all, in order to set up kits, your item has to have an item type of a kit to be entered as a kit. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to bring up my kit item. So this is a kit item. I'm going to go into kits, and I can see the different components that I have set up on the kit. Now, the difference between kits and assemblies is that kits do not track quantities, and the quantities are not taken off the components until the sale. The same with the purchases. When you do a purchase of components, the quantities are going to update on those components, but it's not going to update the kit. So while you can sell kits, which is fine, an easy way to track it, the thing to keep in mind is that your quantities always sit on the component items. So if you sell 5 of these assembled data cards, the quantities are not going to come off of those 4 components until that sale is posted. Whereas if you do assemblies, when you create that assembly, at the time that you create the assembly, the quantities are going to come off of those items and move onto the assembly. So your assembly would, in this case, if this was an assembly, it would take 1 each of these component items to create 1 assembled data card. So when I go and I create that or I sell that, then the quantity stays with, I'm physically selling that assembled data card, and that's where my quantities are pulled from. Kits, however, don't track the quantities on them. All your quantities will always stay on the item. Assembled goods will take the quantities off your component items and move them to the assembled good, like a finished good, and then track the quantities off of that. All right. That takes care of those. So let's take a quick look at some transactions here. Again, if you have any questions on things that I didn't cover, things that you want to talk about, we sure can do that. I will go through a couple of transactions here. I do want to take a quick look at the stock count setup, and then we will open for questions. Okay, so transaction-wise, all the transactions are set up under the transactions section. So we can take a quick look at transaction entry. You're going to default here. It's going to show up as adjustment. You can change that to variance.
Yep, we have a question, Deb, if this is a good time.
Okay.
Is there a way to see how many items you have left at a certain price?
So the different price levels. Yes. So there's a couple different ways that you can do that. I will come back to the transaction entry. But one of the things that you can do is utilize the reports that are built into the system. So you would have your activity, and within that activity report, a couple different places that you can see that. So one of the main places is that you can look at your receipts and your physical inventory. The other thing that you can do is you can look at that historical trial balance, and that's going to show you what's available and what's left in your inventory. And to run a report here, we'll just create a quick one for this. You can choose this by date, by item numbers, and I'll just do a short range of item numbers here. Insert your range, and let me change that to screen. And you can also define by site. And this is then going to show you transactions for those particular items and then cost values. Other ways that you can see that are on the other analysis and activity reports. So I'm just going to save this report. And I would recommend going through the reports, just getting familiar with the information that they show you, so you can see things like your turnover reports here, your purchase advice. So this is the system making recommendations that's based on what you have set up. The other reports that are useful, and we use a lot, are your smart lists. So your smart lists are going to allow you to go in and quickly pull information based on particular items that you have. So in item quantities, you can see your items by site and what you have as far as the different quantities on hand. We can add the cost to this. And then within that, a lot of times the go-tos are set up so that you can drill right back into, let's say in this case, item quantity maintenance, and see the quantities that you have there. So there's a number of different ways to bring up information on your inventory. If there's particular columns that you're not seeing on Smart Lists, we can sure help you with that. First place that I would look on those is going into columns and then clicking on the Add button. This is going to show you all of the columns that are available to add to the report. Can't add more than 140 because it won't go any further than that. But that gets to be too much to track anyway. But anything that's within the Add window for columns is something that you can choose. So as an example, if you wanted to see all your minimum order information, then you could set that up also. You can use the Control key to do non-congruent columns, or you can use the Shift key to use a group of fields. When you add that and click on OK, then those will add based on what you have set up. As always within Smart Lists, you can click on a particular column header to rearrange so that you can see what your quantities are. Within that column window, if you want to move things, then you click on a particular column header and then use the arrow keys to move those left or right. Once you create your report, and if you've got it the way you want it, make sure you click on favorites and save that report so that you don't have to recreate it. So I'm just going to say I added my minimum order information to this. So I'm going to add it and add a favorite. And so now when I look at my report, I have my items by site, but now I have my report with minimum order information on it. Okay, so quickly through transaction entry. Again, you're going to go in here, choose your adjustment. It's going to default in with a number based on your inventory control setup window. Your date will default in with your system date, so you can change that. You're going to choose a batch ID, whether you add a batch or you use an existing batch. then what's your default site ID that you're going to have this transaction? So I'm going to do warehouse in this case and choose my item and then my reason code. And this is just going to pull from the reason codes that you had set up. And then what's the quantity? So at that point, I'm going to take the batch off so that I can just post this. And when I close the window, then I get my transaction posting journal, my GL register, and my cost variance journal. And I'm going to skip my analytical report. And I didn't set my division on my warehouse. But you're going to see the information then for that adjustment. It's going to use the offset account based on what we set up on the reason codes. So here's my 1312 and the transaction that it's included on there. Stock count schedules. I'm going to just close these reports. So stock count schedules, to create a stock count, you're going to go in and give your stock count an ID first. So I'm going to choose my test. Actually, let's do the demo. I have my items on there. When you create this stock count, you can go in and choose the mass add to add items to your stock count list. You can do this based on the stock count date range. You could do it by a site ID if you wanted to just do a group based on a particular site. You could choose by item class or individual item numbers or item types. So if you wanted to mass add a group of items just based on, I'm going to just do these chords. Once you select that and insert it into the restrictions, then it'll go through and it's going to add all of my sites to my stock count. At this point, you can save this and have it set up. You do need to go in and choose Start Count in order to open it up and make it available to count. So I'm going to choose Save, and I'm going to print these reports so you can see these. The second option here is the stock count print options. So this is if you want to print this out, give it to the people that are going to be doing the count for them to manually fill in, and then they would turn those sheets into you and you can key them in. Now, if you use something like Panatrack and you've got the stock count pieces on that, you can use Panatrack and just scan everything. The stock count information will transfer to the Panatrack handhelds so that different users can go in and run, or rather do the counts. If you're going to print these out, what this looks like is you have a page between items. I wouldn't recommend doing that. Printing on-hand quantities, that's really up to you as far as a company policy. The downside to printing the actual on-hand quantities is that if you have a locked count, potentially people won't count. They'll just take the on-hand quantity and then they will just fill that in and not actually count, and you won't necessarily get an accurate number. And then printing your item, lot, or serial numbers. Do you want those to show up? So I'm going to go ahead and choose to print my on-hand quantities. And then my stock count forms, I'm just going to run that to the screen so that you can see this. So one message that you'll get is if the item site combination is in another stock count, it won't do the stock or print it again. An item site combination can only be on one stock count. And that's probably on my test one. So I will actually delete this one, and we will quickly bring up our test. And that one is in process already. So once you have your count done, then you're going to go into stock count entry, bring up your stock count, and then based on either the sheets that you've gotten back from the people doing the stock count, or if you're using Panatrack, this information will fill in so that you can see the counted quantity, the variance quantity, and whether or not that's been verified. In order to finish out the stock count, you do have to check the verified quantities on these and check this checkbox. It won't allow you to finish the stock count until you do. The other thing that you want to make sure is that while you're doing that stock count, all your users are, or rather all your inventory transactions are just going into batches. You don't want to post in between the time that you start your stock count and the time that you complete it, because that'll mess up your numbers as far as accurate counts. So any inventory transactions, if they need to continue working, make sure they go to batches and you do not post those until you get your stock count finished and updated. So we are at 12:30. If I didn't cover something or you have questions on something, feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you, Deb. That was very informative. I have unmuted everyone, so if you have any questions, now would be a great time to ask those.
I don't have any questions.
Who is that?
All right, if we don't have any questions, we'll go ahead and conclude for today. Thank you all for joining us. I will be sending out a recording of today's webinar, and if you have any questions that you think of later, feel free to contact us.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
That was informative. That was
Yeah.
that was more training than I've ever had out of this system.
There you go.
In that little short of time, that was more training, more thorough. Who's that lady?